Here's some thoughts about reading poems as you revise your papers. One of the things I've asked you to do when you revise your poetry papers is to re-engage with the poetry, to go back to your poems and actively reread them and rethink them in light of the comments you've received from me and your peers. I think it would be useful then for me to say a few more words about how to read poetry, because based on your drafts, I've noticed a few common errors, specifically in how you handle end-stopped lines versus enjambed lines. Okay, what do these terms mean? Well, first of all, they're both in the glossary of reading and writing about literature, so you can go look them up there and see what they mean, but I'll also define them here. An end-stopped line is a line of poetry where the grammatical meaning of the sentence ends at the end of the line. The line and the grammatical unit end at the same time. One definition of an end-stopped line goes like this: a line of verse that contains or concludes a complete clause and usually ends with a punctuation mark. Let's look at an example or two from the poems we've read. I want to start with Pat Mora, so I hope this is her. Yes, this is La Migra. Notice how the lines at the beginning of each section of the poem are end-stopped. They contain a complete grammatical meaning. So let's just look at section 1 and section 2. So section 1 over here. Let's play La Migra. I'll be the border patrol. You be the Mexican maid. I get the badge and the sunglasses. Okay, and at the beginning of section 2. Let's play La Migra. You be the border patrol. I'll be the Mexican woman. Your Jeep has a flat. Okay, so you can see there that each line contains its own meaning. It's connected to the next line, but it essentially contains its own meaning. Let's look at a Blake poem. Let's look at the Echo in Green, lines 1 to 4. The sun does arise and make happy the skies. The merry bells ring to welcome the spring. We can do the same if we go to the Lamb. I'm going to look at lines 9 to 16. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. Each of these lines contains or concludes a complete clause. Okay, that's simple enough. But these end-stopped lines can be intermingled amongst lines constructed according to one of my favorite poetic techniques, enjambment. E-N-J-A-M-B-M-E-N-T. Enjambment occurs when the grammatical meaning that the poet is trying to communicate does not conclude at the end of a line of poetry. Rather, the meaning spills over the end of one line and requires you to keep reading into the next line to understand what's being said. Lines that depend on enjambment are called enjambed lines, and here's a glossary definition of enjambment. In poetry, the technique of running over from one line to the next without a stop. So let's look for examples of enjambment in our poetry, and let's go back to Pat Mora. Let's go to La Migra. In section 1, enjambment begins in line 6, but I'll start at line 5 to give us a running start. You can hide and run, but you can't get away because I have a Jeep. I can take you wherever I want, but don't ask questions because I don't speak Spanish. I can touch you wherever I want, but don't complain too much because I've got boots and kick if I have to, and I have handcuffs. Oh, and a gun. Get ready, get set, run. And you look at those last 3 lines, they return to end-stopped. Let's look at the beginning of section 2, where the enjambment begins as early as the 5th line, which is line 23 in the overall poem. And I'll just read the whole of section 2 here, and forgive my getting the Spanish wrong. Let's play La Migra. You be the border patrol. I'll be the Mexican woman. Your Jeep has a flat, and you've been spotted by the sun. All you have is heavy. Hat, glasses, badge, shoes, gun. I know this desert, where to rest, where to drink. Oh, I'm not alone. There she goes to end stopped, but is going to move back to enjambment. You hear us singing and laughing with the wind. Agua dulce brota aquí, aquí, aquí. But since you can't speak Spanish, you do not understand. Get ready. Yeah. Now, let's think about how all this would sound if we read the whole thing as end-stopped lines. And I'm going to start here in section 1. You can hide and run, but you can't get away, because I have a jeep. I can take you wherever. I want, but don't ask. Questions because I don't speak Spanish. I can touch you wherever. I want, but don't complain. Too much because I've got. Right. It just doesn't work. I'm exaggerating, but clearly this approach doesn't work. You've got to go with the enjambment, not only to make it sound good, but also to understand the basic sense of what's being said. Let's go back to Blake. In both the poems that we read, Blake mixes enjambment and end-stopped lines. We'll just look right now at the Lamb, I think. Note how the enjambment starts as early as line 3 to 4, but Blake is then going to move back and forth between enjambed and end-stopped lines. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life, and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing woolly bright? Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice? Okay, why is it important to distinguish between enjambed and end-stopped lines? Partly because if you read all the lines end-stopped, you're going to get the meaning wrong. Also because enjambment and end-stopping are ways for poets to explore themes. If you end-stop all your lines, for example, you may be emphasizing rules, order, clear and direct thoughts. If you enjam your lines, you may be expressing the way your thoughts overflow their boundaries. You may be rejecting restraints. You may be trying to discover new places. So now let's go to Shakespeare, because he is someone who I see as a major master of enjambment. And here we are with Sonnet 116, which a number of you actually wrote about. This is a massively enjambed poem, and if you read it in an end-stopped way, you're going to screw it up. I'm going to start by screwing it up. Let me not to the marriage of true minds. Admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Again, I'm exaggerating, but let's think about what I've just done to the poem by reading it in an end-stopped way. Let me not to the marriage of true minds. I mean, that line makes no sense. Let me not what? We don't know what the poet's talking about. Line 2. Admit impediments. Love is not love. Admit impediments. Taken by itself, that line means bring on the obstacles. Stop putting boundaries. Start putting boundaries in place. Love is not love. Well, that line's a negation of love. Sounds very negative. Which alters when it alteration finds. If we read line 3 by itself, we don't know what's being said. What alters? Or bends with the remover to remove. Similarly in line 4. What bends? We don't know. What we have to do here is read this poem in an enjambed way. Listen to the difference it makes. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Okay, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. When we read those lines in an enjambed fashion, we now know what's being said is, please don't let me get in the way of the proper union of two minds or two people who should be together. Don't let me admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Now what looked like a negation of love is actually an affirmation of love. Love is something that doesn't alter. It doesn't bend. It doesn't take off on you and leave you in the lurch, leave you abandoned, right? So you got to read it in an enjambed way. And my favorite example of Shakespearean enjambment is in Sonnet 29, and I'll finish by reading it. It's a poem about someone who feels sorry for himself because he's alone and he thinks he doesn't have friends and he thinks he's not good looking, that he doesn't have talent. He's down in the dumps. You can almost see his downcast eyes. But then, in the last 6 lines of this sonnet, and a sonnet is a 14-line poem, he remembers one special friend whom he calls thee or you, and his thoughts turn positive. They turn upwards when he remembers this friend. And there's a spectacular act of enjambment in lines 9, 10, 11, and 12, where the speaker compares himself to a lark whose songs climb upward to the very gates of heaven. It's the enjambment that allows this to happen. The lines have been quite end-stopped up to this point while the speaker has been expressing his depression. But as soon as he starts thinking about the friend, his words escape the constraints, if you will, of the 10-syllable lines and push ahead into the next line, as if his joy knows no bounds, as if his joy were like a bird's song filling the air. Here it is, Shakespeare's Sonnet 29. When, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. I love it. Okay. I hope that's helpful. I hope it gives you something to think about as you read and re-engage with these poems moving forward. Thanks, and I look forward to your revisions.